This week's guest, Selys, wrote us to express her thoughts about our use of the word crazy on an earlier show. We invited her to come share her views and learned a lot in the process. We hope you enjoy this as much as we did.
What's good, y'all? My name's Rob Celtic, and I'm a street dancer with my own podcast. If you love films like Step Up and wonder if that's what real dance culture is like, let me just tell you right now, all that Hollywood noise is fake as hell. Drinking and Dance at the End of the World explores the connections between the modern and vintage street dance worlds and their intersections with race, gender, sexuality, politics, and much more. Each episode is a portrait of a dancer who holds a piece of the larger story of dance as our culture knows it. This show is a love letter to the street dance community, and it's also a welcome to all you non-dancers who want a glimpse into a world you may have wondered about, but haven't experienced for yourself. If that sounds like all you've been wanting from a podcast, then let me invite you to sit back, pour yourself a drink, and enjoy the show. I'm Rob Celtic, and this is Drinking and Dance at the End of the World.
Hi, I'm Eric.
And I'm Aisla.
And together we are the hosts of the BiCurean podcast.
BiCurean is our answer to the polarizing culture we live in.
Tired of feeling under siege and looking for ways to get involved? Then come be a part of a different way of thinking.
Everything from politics to geek culture to current events that polarize us as a society, we explore multiple ways of looking at things.
Welcome to the show.
Well, I'm very excited to be here today with, obviously, you and our guest, Selys.
So a little bit of background here. At the end of every show, we do invite people to come and give us their opinions, give us their thoughts, and all of that. And I'm super excited because our guest today took us up on that.
Right. It was, and I mean, there's nothing better than feedback, even criticism, in terms of, because these are things we care about. And so to have somebody else who cares about it reach out and say, I really want to talk about this, and I have this perspective, and it's part of why we invited her to be on the show. She reached out, and also, honestly, we were, at that point, Twitter comrades, maybe? And I just really enjoyed the things that she brought up. So we're hoping to dive into not just that, but also some of the things that she's up to. So I wonder, Selys, would you be willing to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah. And thank you for the background. It's so funny thinking back on it, and because I'm just like, I like the Twitter comrades way of saying that. Like, I usually think like Twitter buddies, but comrades, I love it. It's like we're fighting the good fight. But yeah, so my Twitter is my writing Twitter. And so the way I found like the BiCurean podcast is because I write a lot about progressive Christian topics and social justice through my blog, Worth a Read Too. And that's like TOO, as in like as well. And then from there, I just started listening to a couple episodes, and I don't remember the exact one, but one of them was about mental health. And I don't remember exactly what was said, but there was just something that I thought should have been explained a little differently. And so I direct messaged the BiCurean account. And then later I think I followed you personally. And then from there, we kind of just continued conversations. And so I'm happy to be here. And, we can definitely talk later about my books and what I've been up to, but I'm like kind of cool with just diving in.
And we will definitely post links that you send us for people to check out in the show notes. So.
She's like A+ student. She already sent everything.
It's amazing because we have people who are professionals that, like we bring on as guests. They are probably guests on, I know we've had people on that have been guests on big major news networks and stuff, and they're not that prepared.
Anyway, she was great. So we also didn't talk about this directly, but we've started doing a little icebreaker on the show. I don't know if you've listened to a more recent episode, so maybe you have a sneak peek. Mm-hmm. But
the last episode I listened to was the superhero one.
Okay, so
the one about like Marvel and
that's a fun. That's the one we did with Matt, right? So this is, how would you define BiCurean? If someone made you on a podcast, like right,
if you were a guest
on a podcast right now, and they were like, "How would you define it?"
Pop quiz. So am I supposed to go first?
Yep.
Yeah, no. This is
I've
just for
done
you.
this before a few times, but you're new, so you have to go next.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I consider it, I guess that's where I was looking for progressive Christian podcasts, and that's kind of where this started. But it also seems very just open about different conversations, and just kind of, I guess the bi part I connect to being bisexual. And so I kind of like think of it, I guess, of this idea of just this multi-sided identity, whether it's through faith or or conversation or things like that. So it just seems very open to me, and I guess that's kind of where, which also is kind of progressive Christian, is much more open than perhaps other branches of Christianity. So that's kind of what I think, what I would associate BiCurean with, would be open.
Yeah,
Did I pass?
I love that. That's the bi part of it is definitely, that was chosen on purpose for, like you said, whether you're bisexual or bi as in two, as in there's two sides to every story. There's that's a lot of what the concept was when we came up with it. I will say, interestingly, the episode you're talking about where we spoke to the Christian minister and that you found and listened to, Roger.
Mm-hmm. Roger Woolsey.
Yeah, he was actually one of the first ideas we had for doing this, because Isola's background is in LGBT rights and working in that. And there is, I mean, you've outed yourself, so I can talk about this a little bit, but, being interested in progressive Christian stuff and bisexual or gay has a certain connotation. And it was one of the first things we talked about, was the dichotomy that you run into trying to be faithful in that way versus, who you actually are sexually or whatever, however you define. So, it's kind of, it's an interesting topic that keeps on finding its way back to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And that's something I could talk about till I'm blue in the face as well. Actually, recently, the last blog post that I haven't promoted yet that I just published was, interestingly enough, and this is just something maybe later we can talk about, but outside of here. But the book is called, what's it called? The Galilee Episode, Two Men in One Bed, Two Women Grinding, by, let's see, Ronald Goetz. And the premises is about Luke 17, verses 34 to 35, where apparently his argument is that Jesus is talking about same-sex couples. And that is just, the book's very interesting. I have mixed feelings about it, but it's a very interesting argument. So it's interesting with me doing that, having done my first post coming out publicly, being bisexual and Christian, and then kind of coming in here and having this conversation. So sometimes things just fall into place.
Yeah. It's very interesting, because it's very core to the concept that we had behind BiCurean. It's been hard to get out of all manner of other political things that have been happening since we got started. We were originally hoping to do just more human interest stuff, but the reality is it seems like every week something very pressing and urgent that we need to see both sides on comes up. And so we've been more topical and straight out of the headlines than we even intended to be. And maybe eventually we can get back there. We'll see. But this is definitely something that we should talk about. I'm very intrigued.
Yeah. Well, and for me to just really quickly summarize that, when I was doing the work in the LGBT community, the pain that I saw in folks that came out as gay, who also had a strong faith, and the ways in which they were rejected by both communities, like to be perhaps unfair, I had more of a judgment on the gay people, judging other gay people for their faith, because I'm like, what it's like to be rejected. Like, you can say you don't want to be with someone who has a faith because it doesn't work for you, but to demean them for it, I found that to be difficult, because so many of the gay people that I knew that had faith felt they had to hide it. I was like, so you have to go into like the religious closet? I don't know. Like, that just feels wrong, really wrong. And I understood there's a lot of harm that's been done in the name of Christianity to a lot of communities. So there's understandable motivation for that. And it was a place where I started really feeling the sense of like, we live in a lot of pain because we're asked to choose between things that are impossible to choose between. Our faith and our orientation, our desire for a lifetime companion that we feel genuinely connected to, or our sense of community. Like, these are not optional aspects of human experience. And to feel like you have to crush one in order to allow another one to exist is a violence that feels unnecessary, and I think contributes to the pain in the world. And so for us and for me, like BiCurean is saying, like, they're not in opposition. They coexist. How do we find that? How do we find the places where they intersect? And let's look for that rather than the places where they oppose.
Absolutely. And I love that you bring up the word intersect, because intersectionality is one of also my favorite topics to consider. And we do forget, people of faith who are queer, like that's a thing. And then the mental health aspect of both sides as well. There's a lot of mental health damage that's been done in the Christian world. So there's a lot of mental health damage that's come because of being LGBT plus, and then just that intersectionality, like definitely that the emotional wounds from that is just doubled.
Well, I think that actually is a good segue into one of the main topics that we had in inviting you on. So you noticed something about some language that we used in a show, and actually reached out on Twitter, and it's kind of what led to all of this actually having you on. Perhaps you can share what you saw, what your experience and reaction and stuff were.
Okay. I don't honestly 100% remember exactly what it was in that episode. But
it's been a minute, I think. So.
Yes. But I can definitely talk about just the language that we use and how we talk about mental health in both in secular and even Christian circles, if that's cool.
That's perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, usually with mental health, it's often like derogatorily talked about, or even if we don't mean it to be, sometimes comes off offensive. And it's just learning vocabulary. In social work, which I didn't mention, but I am a social worker, we learned about like the person-centered approach. I don't know if either of you have heard of that before.
I'm sort of familiar, but for the benefit of our listeners, perhaps you can explain it. And me, so that I can actually know for sure that I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so with the person-centered approach is that the person is more important than any mental health challenge or disability. So instead of saying a mentally challenged or disabled person, you'd say a person with mental health challenges or disabilities. And the same goes for a specific diagnosis, and especially like saying someone's schizo. You wouldn't say that. It's a person with schizophrenia. You also wouldn't say schizophrenic person. Like, so usually it's the person first and then whatever challenge afterwards. And that's something that I think would be a great starting point at the very least, because people throw around diagnoses all the time, even if you're not a mental health professional, like, oh my gosh, they're BPD, or oh my gosh, they're bipolar, oh, they're just OCD. Like, you don't know that, and you're discounting that. Even if it was true, their mental health concerns are still valid to them. And even being a mental health professional, I know I try not to diagnose people because I don't want to see people through labels, although diagnoses can be helpful in guiding treatment and finding the right group support and everything like that. And it was like that for me. But the throwing around and casual conversation really bothers me. And I think that's something to just kind of keep in consideration for both people who are mental health professionals and who aren't. So unless you're a mental health professional who has a client, like, and you're in that conversation with them, like, there's really no reason to be just going out and labeling just in casual conversation. And then
I completely agree with you. I think it's one of those things we do flippantly. There's a lot of things that I think a lot of people do flippantly. I think one of the things that had come up is that probably me, I'll blame myself, might have thrown the word around like, that's just crazy, or they're just crazy, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm gathering that was something that you had an opinion on.
That might have been it. Yeah, I definitely do. That really bothers me, the word. And it's just, I think it should be avoided. And I just think, I guess as a writer, there's so many words out there that you can use when we say crazy. And it can be very triggering. So that's why I think it just has to be very careful. I don't know if either of you know the history of the word, which is kind of interesting.
No, tell us the history. I looked up the definition because that's where I start, but I didn't look up the etymology. So
yeah, no problem. Actually, yeah, I looked up the etymology when we were talking just beforehand. So the online etymology dictionary is a pretty cool place to check out. Apparently the word goes back to like the 1570s, which I think is pretty interesting. But back then it meant more like diseased, sickly. We don't really use it exactly like that nowadays. Then from there in the 1580s, it was more like broken, impaired, full of cracks or flaws. 1610s went to deranged, demented, of unsound mind or behaving as so. And that I think is kind of what's stuck around. And then later there was like drive someone crazy in 1873, 1905, like live, it's been like crazy. So doing something with more vigor, frequency. And then finally in 1927, that's when the jazz slang for cool and exciting came around. And I think that's kind of that with the deranged or demented idea. I think those are the two kind of sides of the coin that I think happens a lot in society. So if someone's like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. Like, what do you really mean? Are you saying that person is doing something just bizarre? Like, whoa, that's different, or are you really trying to say something negative about their mental health? And I think for me, I had a mental health situation a couple years ago, and I had someone I love who just called me crazy, and that set me off even worse. No way am I going to be like, you know what? Let me think logically. If someone thinks this is crazy, I should just stop doing it. Like, that's not going to happen.
Fair.
So I think it's just being cognizant about our like how we talk, and I think that's just definitely one of the terms to get started with.
Well, and absolutely, like I know part of the motivation we have for asking people to give us their feedback is we recognize that we're not trying to hold ourselves up as if having things all together. Like, we recognize we're flawed humans just like anyone else. And so we expect that we are going to say or express ideas that have an impact or cause a reaction. And it's part of the way we want people to come forward and share their perspective or their experience or the impact, so we can have that opportunity for learning. And part of why specifically for this topic I wanted to invite you on is that I do feel like it's a delicate situation, in that exactly that for folks who have gone through certain things, it can be very triggering. And then there's also the experience of I have two other aspects of it where, like, one, I'm sitting here and I watch things happening and they don't feel like sane to me, like in the world. And so that's an assessment I have of the behaviors. However, I also understand that there's a way in which the things that don't trigger us, like, for example, several years ago, I grew up in an era when you didn't like something, it wasn't cool, you call it lame. And I was actually doing social justice trainings, and we were talking about a new word, and I realized, like, oh, I say this word and I don't even think about what it means. Like, it's a word to me. It has no actual meaning. However, it's very ableist, and I'm confident that if I say it around someone who is experiencing some aspect of physical disability, they could receive it, right? Like, it's hard to know. No one has ever once said, don't say lame. I've never had anyone call me out for it. It was just an awareness that I had that I didn't really think about it. And so similarly, I would think they were talking about, don't say that's so gay. And I was like, oh, but it was the same kind of thing, right? And so, and yet at the same time, and one of the things that I've appreciated about this work with Eric is that we do try to be really genuine and just talk about things and not try to couch it in the right phraseology, and as so much as try to. And so we know that there are times when we say things, we're like, was that the best thing to have said? But we want to have that dialogue with people where they step in and not assume on behalf of. So I don't know. For me, it's pretty complicated in some aspects, because I also know that, like, I know lots of people who won't say anything because they're so afraid of saying the wrong thing. And that's a place that I never want to be or create. I'd rather people step up and say what they think and say how they perceive something so that we can have a conversation than that people shut down and say nothing out of fear, right? Like, that's not, to me, that's not better. But I don't know. So I throw a lot of, like, random things at you. If you have any thoughts, or Eric, so to step in with, or I can ramble more. I'm full of excellent ramblings, or I think they're excellent. I don't know. You'll have to judge.
No, yeah, definitely. It's funny you say that, because I've been thinking about that. recently, the mindfulness before saying something, because when you get used to being around someone, you just kind of start blurting stuff. When you don't think about it as much versus if maybe you're out in public. I know when I'm in front of a student, I work at a school, like I think very deeply about what I'm going to say, how I'm going to respond. But if I'm just around like a friend, I just kind of just speak. And I know the other day I accidentally said something, I took a joke too far and I felt really bad, and I immediately apologized and made a commitment not to do to my friend and to myself that I wasn't going to do that again. And I think part of it, what you were talking about with the that's so gay, and then the people being afraid to say something, I think it's kind of maybe an accountability and a responsibility to think before you speak, but then when you make a mistake, to be accountable to that. So that, for example, I have there's a trans family member that we were talking about the pronoun change, and there was someone else I was talking to who kept using the wrong pronoun, and I corrected them, and I caught myself saying the wrong pronoun, and I felt very guilty about it when in my head I got so used to making that switch of, because I also have gotten like training in the LGBT field with social work and everything. But when I was talking to this trans family member about it, she sent me a really good list of kind of just talking points with being able to kind of help the trans community with in things like the pronoun usage. And one of the things that they just said was like, if someone corrects you or if you find yourself saying the wrong one, just you correct yourself, acknowledge it, move on. Don't over apologize about it to the point where the trans person has to feel like they have to say, oh, it's okay, because it's not really okay. It's just a mistake. We all make mistakes. We're not perfect. And so I think that kind of can relate when it comes to things like mental health, and, saying, if we say something like, oh, so that disabled person, and if someone's like, well, it's a person with a disability. Oh, right. Sorry, a person with a disability, and kind of go from there.
Yeah. When I think, and I know for me, like I did appreciate the distinction. I definitely, I know I have some, like, I would say instinctive reactions, like words I use without thinking about them. And crazy is definitely a word that I will use on occasion. And I've had this conversation with friends in other ways. And I also do feel like there's a space where when I see something happening where, like my mother was genuinely demented and actually diagnosed, that's what was going on. She was acting crazy, and it didn't, that was my experience of the situation. And, I had to navigate that. And so I definitely felt comfortable describing what was happening. And then in the larger sense, I feel like we've been in a social situation where we have people who are denying objective reality, like not opinions. Like there are people who think Biden is not president. And I that to me is at minimum delusional. And it's I think it's dangerous. Like I don't think it's, I mean, in the long run, one of the things that I realized is I kind of asked myself, like, why do I have a stronger feeling about Trump than, say, Clinton, who I also feel was a big liar? Like, I'm not particularly Democratic. I have a progressive feeling, but I'm more complicated than a party. And at the same time, for me, it was because the situation that I saw occur with Trump, and that I've seen some journalists write about in very thoughtful ways, is that the lies that he told distanced us from reality. We do not have a shared reality as a country anymore. And that is very dangerous. And to me, it is crazy to believe that Biden and Trump switched faces like in a movie like Face Off. And and that's out there with people genuinely saying, and I was like, no, that can't be true. And I'm like, okay, this is actually a forum and these are actually people. And I really want to believe they're making it up. But then they did other things publicly that made it seem like, some of them believe some of this. This is very upsetting. And so I guess for me, I'm not going to insist on using that particular word. But I'd like actually some like thoughts on how do we talk about things that are not reflexive around it, but just like legitimately like this is how I feel. Like, this feels super delusional and dangerous.
And I would say it isn't necessarily person focused, but people focused, right? You could talk, this person has a delusion that our country is no longer run by, the person that was elected or whatever. But, even a group sense, I think that's sort of what we're talking about here is, and I've taken to using the term delusional because I have experience with narcissism and all of that. And delusions are a key ingredient in that. And we were run by a certified narcissist for 4 years who brought a whole bunch of people into what can only be described as a narcissistic delusion. So I've chosen to use that word specifically due to the language that I've learned from mental health in that case. So I just wanted to actually throw out there, I think it's different if you're talking about a delusional person or a delusional concept many people might share.
Yeah. And I mean, like I said, I'm not committed to it, but I am curious how you would parse that, or what your view on how to approach it would be, because I do think we need to be respectful of people, and I'm concerned.
I mean, you brought up good points, and before I kind of get into what the thoughts that came up when Eric, you mentioned certified narcissist, right, for Trump. Did that actually happen? Like, did he actually get diagnosed?
Well, he got diagnosed by a lot of doctors on TV, in so much as people with letters after their name and possibly a DR in front of it had said that, this is all indicative of narcissistic behavior. To get up there and like repeat a lie that, daily lies, new ones often, is pretty much DSM textbook narcissistic behavior. And so, no, I don't think that he walked out of an office with a doctor that told him you're a narcissist, but as being such a public figure, being analyzed daily, it was a consensus, let's call it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, because I remember I had run into someone who had said something like that. And I like what you had said, that doctors, for example, would saying that this is indicative of narcissistic behavior. But when again, it's the same thing of like throwing around, even Trump, as much as I personally don't like him, I also wouldn't want to just diagnose like that. But the narcissistic behavior is still problematic and does still need to be addressed. And what you brought up about being people-centered, that when it came to the Trump supporter community was really hard for me, trying to understand like where they were coming from. And I saw you were mentioning like, this is crazy, I can't believe this is happening or whatever. And I also had the same feeling. I guess, I don't know if it's from being a writer, that I was more like, this is mind boggling. Like, I can't wrap my mind around it. This is so bizarre. Like, I can't believe I live in this right now. This is like a dystopian novel. So that's kind of like the way I was thinking about it. And so it's definitely still stuff that has to be addressed, and it's unhealthy. And I guess when we talk about people in general as a community, we can still keep the person-centered approach. Same way why we don't want to like generalize a community and just say like all oppressive people are whatever adjective in general, when they are people and they have their value as people. So I guess let me kind of like backtrack with that. I'm trying to think. I'll give an example of like a stereotype, like the angry Latina. Mm-hmm. So I'm Hispanic, right? It's angry Latina. So that getting put into that. So like, all Latino women, angry Latino women. So that's this community seen this way, as opposed to they're Latinas who are very passionate. And that, I guess, is kind of what I try to do with communities, even when I really don't understand them. And kind of, I guess I'm trying to, you both brought up like two different things. I'm trying to answer them both at the same time.
We do.
It was not fair. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay.
And again, I'm not saying that you're necessarily, I'm curious to get your opinion, because it sounds like this is something you've thought about. So by all means, like what you say here is not like right or wrong, In that, I think this is something we all just need to discuss, right? Like, and be able to talk about, like, what are alternatives? If you have an idea, we should talk about that, right? So
yeah, definitely don't. What Eric said.
No, look, Eric, I'm always right except when I'm wrong. Okay.
aren't we all?
I'm glad we got that out of the way.
It's also funny, right? Because I have a microphone and a platform, and I actually try to check myself because I don't want to be right all the time.
Really?
It's
No.
well,
I mean,
when I'm on the mic, I don't want to be right all the time. But it's a curiosity thing, right? Like, just I like what you suggested, and I use the terms mind-boggling. It's like mind-boggling. It is, out of touch with reality that I live in concept. I do. I speak that way. So I think you made some good points about, to me, what I'm hearing, and I'm curious to get your opinion on this. So I come from some very deep Eastern philosophy things. And one of the key things about Eastern philosophy versus Western philosophy, and this applies to religion, all sorts of things, but it's a lot of internalizing versus externalizing. And in the West, and we're Western culture, we tend to like, those people are crazy. That person is dumb, and not necessarily internalize. That person's intelligence might be in question here, based on, a bunch of factors. But ultimately, what I heard you doing is something that I recall from Eastern philosophy of, I am not the center of a universe. The things that are happening, I need to approach them internally and how I react to them, instead of externalizing. It literally does come down to the simple concept of whether or not you think the world's happening to you, or you are experiencing the world and processing it. So the words that you use, and the reason that I resonate with that, does come from that concept of internalizing things versus externalizing.
Absolutely. And I think maybe from there, I didn't realize there were terms for those, which is great. The more I learn, because I also am not right all the time. It's funny because I'll do the joke and then I'll tell what I was thinking with my mom whenever I'm right. Because growing up, I was always like, I hate when you're always right. So now whenever I'm right, I'll be like, wait, what did you say? Okay, can you say it again? And then when she'll like say it, she doesn't want to, she's like, oh, you're right. And she'll like mumble it. And I'll do this like dance. I'm like, oh, it's the rightness reign. That's raining over me. So like, it's funny that just to joke about that. But with the externalizing and internalizing, I think that's a really good point. And it reminds me, I think, of what I kind of was trying to get at, which is everybody, right? We make up a community, but everybody comes to these conclusions, and whether that's ultimately ends up in behavior that seems crazy, quote unquote, out of the norm, right, out of the status quo or not, it comes from somewhere. Everything has some kind of background, and when you think about, like, things happened to Trump that made Trump who he is. There are genetics that made him who he is.
His niece had some opinions on that. She wrote a book. It was pretty good.
Yeah, it was really good.
Well, okay. And then feel free to share that with me. But when I guess I think about this a lot too, when it comes to like racism, homophobia, like where did that stem from? For me, that's very difficult to talk to someone about that, about discrimination. Like, okay, but where did you learn that? Why do you think that? Why are you saying that? When it's something that I specifically have been discriminated against for, but when it's a community that I haven't been, and there isn't someone from that community currently in the conversation and to stand up for themselves. And I, as someone who's an ally, am the only person there, I try to not speak for them. And I've been trying really hard to think about, to be mindful of that, but to direct attention toward them or a movement or something like that. And those people, though, who still, I shouldn't say those people, but the people who still struggle with whether it's racism, have reality, all those things, there is something intrinsically in them individually, and then eventually culminating, we're seeing trends in certain communities that still comes from somewhere. And I tried to do that a lot to understand, even if I don't understand why all these people are following Trump, I can't, especially women, or especially people of color, or especially people who are queer, I cannot wrap my mind around it. But something for them, and this is why I do a lot of research and go into the news until I get burn out, is something, whether in their personal lives or history or something, is attracting them to this. And that's kind of like what I try to keep in mind. So then when I do run into someone who is a Trump supporter or who is something that I like have such a strong feeling against, that I can feel like I can at least be civil if I can't.
Well, and I watched, oh, am I interrupting you? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I didn't remember. I trolled off. Go ahead.
Well, one, I was trying to be funny and I feel like I was rude. So I'm sorry because I thought I was funny, but I don't think I was. So you're amazing, Eric.
Okay.
Just want to be clear. Like I was like, the way I said that came off sounding really mean. And that is not anything that I feel around that. So
thank you.
I feel bad.
And look, I think that's a thing. I want to live in a world where we can joke and laugh. Honestly, I feel like comedy has suffered right now. It is not okay. Comedy has always walked a line of satire, and satire right now is not okay. And I'm saying this as a person in the social justice community, with passionate beliefs around all of that. But, case in point, like, it is very easy to be offensive. And I think we're at a little bit of a correction point right now of figuring out how to talk about things.
Mm-hmm. Like just now, I thought I was funny and maybe I was offensive.
And on the other hand, I mean, I would also be one to advocate that I think it's okay to have a little bit thicker skin on certain things because, like I said, this is a fine line. I don't even know how to necessarily frame this, but there has to be kind of a little bit of a happy medium for, frankly, the American language is filled with colloquialisms. I mean, I have no idea with the fun factor of something being related to its temperature, and yet we'll probably say cool a few more times today.
Right. Well, and I think that's what you're saying. I think it's important that it's a balance in that we want to be mindful and we also want to be human. And we want people to feel comfortable and safe saying things out loud and not just shutting down, because it's not just silencing the folks that we are considering to be harmful. It's also silencing allies. The number of people that I know that have what I consider to be very thoughtful, progressive views on, say, immigration that simply won't speak out because they're afraid of saying it wrong. And I'm just like, but you are not adding anything to the mix. And it used to be like, and this, maybe we can get into this a little bit more with you, like the Christians, progressive Christians wouldn't speak out. So the only people who were representing Christianity were the very conservative right-wing folks. And they were...
At least they were the ones with a platform for what most people on the outside of that can tell.
Exactly. They were the ones that they had the loudest voices, they had the biggest platform. And so that's what people thought Christianity was, who weren't highly associated with it. And the Christians who felt differently, the ones that I knew, because I come from a religious background, a lot of them were uncomfortable speaking out. They didn't want to be shamed, attacked, rejected. And so this fear of getting it wrong or offending or hurting leads to only the extremes being what gets heard from. And the extremes are rarely representative of any group. I was watching a Cup of Joe or something like a year ago with Anand Giridharadas, and he made this point, and I thought it was so perfect. He said, you cannot judge any group ideology by the extremes. And yet, he didn't say this part, I'm adding it, that those are the things that we see. Those are the people that we see. That's what the news puts up there, because the news, by definition, is that which deviates from the norm. So they're not going to bring on the progressive Christian who took care of their neighbor by bringing them soup and picked up groceries. I mean, they might now because of COVID, but they're not going to bring that on. They're going to talk about the radical right-wing Christian that said that all gay people in northern Utah should kill themselves. And that's what we're going to hear about.
Oh my gosh.
That's an exaggeration.
But those things, that's the extremes, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There was a bishop in northern Utah who was counseling young gay teenagers that they should kill themselves. This is about 15 years ago when I was more active. But like, that's who you're going to hear about, right? You're not going to hear about all the Mormon bishops who struggled to find the right solution or support the family, because I'm sure there were plenty. You're going to hear about the one that did active, scary harm. And some of that is also because most of us don't want to go out there and I do this show because I care, for the most part, most of us want to like make breakfast and hang out with our kids and do our hobby. Like we want to just live our lives. It's the extremes that care about getting it out there. And so that's what everybody's judging these things on. And it's not accurate.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I have like 5 things I want to say in response to everything. But well, to start with the comedy thing, and I'm glad that you brought that up, Eric, because that's actually something I remember and for some reason, I don't remember what we were talking about it in my school. We were having like an educational meeting with all the instructors and staff and everything. And for some reason, we got on the topic about topics that can't be joked about, like certain issues that can't be joked about. Is there anything that's just completely off topic? And I think it might have been trying to figure out what the students can and cannot be allowed to do for their projects. And I just remember being like, for me, I never find any joke about sexual violence funny. Like that is absolutely horrific to me. It disgusts me and just saying that made me like red in the face, especially because I was speaking to my supervisor who I respect a lot, but he is still a white male. And that just kind of like, I didn't really know him as much at the time. Now he's like, I mean, he's amazing. I could definitely say anything like that to him now. You know, he's an ally, but he made this really good point, which was like, but can you make a joke about, for example, that said topic without supporting it? Like, it's not that you're saying that that's okay or that's cool or that's funny, but for example, like even just making fun of someone who doesn't think it exists. You know, I remember, I think it was Stephen Colbert who made a joke. I don't remember who the person was, but it was some government official who was like, global warming doesn't exist because I was cold. And he was like, and there's no world hunger because I just had lunch. Right. You know, and so that's kind of what I would think about that. It is a fine line. I don't have an answer exactly necessarily, just kind of that to meditate on, probably. And from there, kind of going more into we're talking about with the extremes, I have this belief, and I really like all those quotes that you were saying, like Isla just totally like spoke to my heart. And the story about the pastor in Utah is just horrific. But I have this theory. I'm just like, society is like a pendulum. You know, we swing from one extreme to another, and we're hopefully trying to get to that middle point. And it's not necessarily always we're never going to be perfect, but hopefully as time goes by, we get closer and closer to that. But I see that like when you're talking about in the progressive circles. So for example, the topic of social justice advocate versus social justice warriors. To me, I consider myself a social justice advocate. And because I try to be very balanced, you know, when I say I'm a feminist, I don't mean women are better than men. I mean, men and women are equal. But I have seen things like, I remember I had someone who told me they were just playing video games. There was some video game chat room and a young man opened up about when he was, I guess, a kid, having been molested by a female instructor. And the other men in the video chat room were like, dude, like if I had like a female, like a hot chick and like teacher wanting to do whatever to me, like I would have let him. Like that's so like blah blah blah. Like how could you like don't be a whatever? And then a woman came in to a conversation and said, well, men can't get raped.
Right.
Like, yeah. And to me, so that came off very social justice warrior to me, which was like an extreme, which is just not true. And that's so harmful because we don't have enough statistics about men who have been sexually abused.
Well, welcome to not making about that person's experience. Congratulations, yeah. Right? Like...
Yeah, too. And that's just, oh my gosh. And we definitely, just to kind of bring that full circle, definitely happens with mental health as well. Kind of like, you know, that extreme of just like, we don't want to say the wrong thing, so we don't acknowledge that someone has a mental health concern. Like we don't, that's not what I'm saying. Hopefully that's not what's coming across. You know, it's with, you don't have to believe someone's delusion to still help them or like get to get help, for example, mental health, professional mental health help. I had a social work instructor who, she said she was like going to a play or something or a movie theater, and she just when she was walking the parking lot, there was this woman with a cart, and she had like a bunch of like Beanie Babies, I guess, in the cart,
Hmm.
and she was just talking out loud and being really loud and freaking out because this like, I guess, I don't know if it was a police officer or a security guard or something, was seeing her as like a disruption, right? Making the people going to this whatever this show was uncomfortable in the parking lot. And I guess they touched the shopping cart and she freaked out and started like just yelling and whatever and all these things. And my instructor, being a social worker, went in and talked to her to find out why she was freaking out so much. Because to the police officer, is like probably like, this is a cart with toys in it. Let me move it out of the way so you can get out of the way and these people can go to their show. It's not that big a deal. But she was freaking out. And what the social worker, she talked to her and was like, hey, so what do you, what's going on here? And this person definitely did have a little delusion. She really believed that these were her children. And she didn't want them to be taken away. I don't know if maybe she had some kind of trauma in the past where she actually did have children taken away. That's something that I literally hadn't even thought of till now. But I've had more experience since then. And so she talked to her and explained like, no one's going to hurt your children or your babies. They just want to move your children and babies out of the way. So actually they're safer where the cars aren't coming by, all the people are here and all that. And the woman calmed down and I think she went with him and moved the cart. Like, of course, my instructor didn't really believe that the Beanie Babies were her physical children.
Right.
But she still was able to help her and get it, find that middle ground, even though that was really like someone might say that like she's crazy or that's definitely bizarre, out of the norm.
What you just described has a name. It's called empathy, and it's amazing how few people have it. And I think that's really the key to any of this, is to just understand you may not be lame, you may not have a disability, but if you flippantly say that, especially in front of somebody with one, or you make it a part of your vernacular in such a way, right, that could become something where you just seem like an insensitive person. So for me, of course, I'm like overly empathic at times to the point of personal harm, but that's truly what it comes down to, is just understanding somebody's experience. Try not to be insulting. Try to actually understand that maybe the situation that they're in is difficult, and maybe being flippant about it, even if it's just colloquial, isn't sensitive and kind. So it's not even a matter of being, for me, like a social justice warrior to get the terminology right all the time. It's about being nice and kind. And I love this word. I'm convinced half the population doesn't know what it means. Considerate.
Well, and I think, oh, go ahead.
No, yeah, no, I was just saying I agree for sure. And I definitely, what you were explaining about to being overly empathetic to the point of of personal harm, what you're talking about is being burnt out,
Yes.
Which is definitely happening right now with COVID. I don't know where you were going to go with what you were going to say, Scylla, and you're free to do that before I kind of like...
No, but that's exactly, yeah. I mean, I am, and it's hard, I think, for anybody that does practice empathy, which I do think it's something that you have to practice and understand and just pause for a second and try to understand other people's things. Yeah, it's hard. COVID has been really hard.
Yeah, it's taken us all to the edge of, I mean, just everybody's patience and room for even personal empathy for themselves, right? Like, we were all so drained that I think a lot of stuff is a lot more on the surface.
One example I have of it, and this was during the political cycle right towards the election, and Trump got up and gave a speech, and it got put on the news, and he said, all the news is talking about is COVID. You just turn on the news and it's just COVID, 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 COVID. And it's so not a big deal. And a plane could crash with 500 people on it, and they still wouldn't talk about it because it's just COVID, COVID, COVID. And I'm sitting here, and I realized just how crushing that was to me for a couple of reasons. One, first of all, a plane crashing with 500 people would be tragic, and the 3,000 people that died today from COVID is also tragic. So that's why they're talking about it. And two, the only real issue that you have with them talking about it, you're not even hiding this, is because it's not serving you right now towards your goals of becoming elected again. So not only are you blowing off 3,000 or however many had died that day and potentially 500 in a plane crash that in your opinion would not get talked about, but you really are saying that you're annoyed about all of it because it's not talking about how great you are in getting you reelected. Sort of my prime example of what narcissistic behavior looks like. He's the center of the universe in that situation. But, and again, I'm not trying to diagnose him. I am actually just acknowledging what's happening. But that's why this is hard for so many people, right? Because ultimately, I just logicked out something that most people feel. Mm-hmm. And they don't necessarily, another thing that we're talking about in depth here that I'm a huge fan of is critical thinking. And a lot of what you said, how you could have a conversation and say, that disabled person or that person with a disability. What you've done there is paused and thought critically about what you're actually trying to describe and then describing it accurately. It's not a ball with red on it. It's a red ball. Makes sense, right? Like how you say that is going to describe the situation differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That is really good. I'm really glad that you brought up those words like the critical thinking and the being considerate and all of that, because and the Trump being the center of the universe and all that. And really what that is getting at too is understanding, because that's what empathy is. You're trying to understand someone else, and people just can't sometimes do that. Like one of the terms, kind of bringing full circle, is that one of the phrases I can't stand when people are like, well, I don't know why you're depressed because I had something worse happen to me and I'm fine. Like, okay.
Why are you having a problem? I'm okay.
Yeah. Like,
I had lunch, so there's no world hunger.
I was about to say, I was like, yeah, I was cold, so there's no global warming. So yeah, and it's like, I'm sorry whatever happened to you, but this person, you don't know if they had the same resources. They might, this person might not have had, for example, a loving, supportive family. This person might not have had access to mental health help, or this person might have also something that you don't have. Like this person might have a genetic history of a certain mental health illness, which is something people don't acknowledge. I don't know if either of you have ever heard that someone being like, mental health isn't real, it's just in your head. Have you ever heard anybody say that?
Yes, I have some family members who have had that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that bothers me.
Why can't you just get over it?
Mm-hmm. Well, and also, you're reminding me, is it all right if I interject it or would I be
it's okay if you don't want to forget what you were going to say.
No, I can. Well, it just fits in, but I'll wait. Go. So finish the thought. No.
Well, just to make just that point was just that it's all in your head. Yeah, because it's in your brain, and your brain is an organ, which is just as important as any other organ. Just because you can't see what's going on in that challenge or illness or something doesn't mean it's not real. For example, I have asthma. Can you just look at me right now and say that I have asthma? No. And if I'm dancing or whatever, like I have learned to take my inhaler when I need it, so my medication. I have learned to do the right kind of exercise that works for me, like yoga, right? So that's a treatment. And that has helped me cope with my asthma, but I will always live with my asthma. That doesn't necessarily have a cure. It's the exact same as my mental health condition, which I also take medication for, which I have borderline personality disorder, and it's something that I want to advocate more for. I have had treatment for it, the right kind of treatment for it to learn how to cope. I have taken medication. And now you look at me and I tell people that, and people are like, you do not look like someone who has BPD. And
what does somebody with BPD look like?
Yeah,
I love
exactly.
that.
I don't have any idea what someone would look. I know.
So, it's just ridiculous. And it's what's something fascinating. Like, can I nerd out for a second?
Yes, please do.
Okay, so you both look like people who appreciate nerding out moments.
Oh yes.
So with the brain, right? There's two distinct things that I always say when someone says like it's all in your head. And I've had family members say that to me, and when I said this, they were like, just like in shock. So with a PET scan, have you ever seen a PET scan of a brain with depression and one without depression?
I think I have, but I'm not recalling the images in my mind right now.
I'm definitely not recalling them.
So there's definitely a visible difference. And that's because the brain with depression has less brain activity.
Mm.
So you'll see like a coloration different, like there's less of the whatever the colors mean. I'm not a neurologist, but there's less of that. You don't have to be a neurologist to see that there's fewer, that there's more dark colors in the brain that has depression than the one that doesn't. And with trauma, this one like blew my mind. So the hippocampus, right? That's the front part of the brain, like the part that is the ability. We all know that's where our ability to recall memories comes from. With trauma, that can actually make your hippocampus smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Like that literally affects your brain. Like
Mm-hmm.
size of it. That's just bizarre to me. And not bizarre, it's really interesting. And I don't know exactly how that looks. I don't know if that's the reason why someone who has trauma might not be able to access those memories. Because I'm not a neurologist and I'd love to learn more about that. But whatever affects the symptoms of trauma can be related to that. This is all very real and biological. And when I said that to my family member, who is a person of science, and I remember my mom pointed that out. She's like, "You're a person of like in your field. You're a person of science. How can you not believe this? How can you not like understand? This isn't something like an opinion. Like it's like a fact." So,
Yeah.
And they were just like stunned. They're like, "I didn't know that. I wish you
Mental
had just
health
tried
is
to understand."
it's a strange stigma, and it is, and I'm really glad to be seeing like more commercials, especially for men, because they will be the first ones in general to blow it off. So there's been some commercials with like sports figures talking about, I went and got help, and that doesn't make me weak. It's like, okay, that's the
Boys
thing.
or men don't cry.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I mean, it's what you're talking about really is the stigma of a lot of this. And, it sounds like I hear things like that, and it sounds like somebody who doesn't really want to know how their brain works, certainly isn't interested in how other people's brains work, other than that they think they're fine and everyone else should be too. But that's fundamentally the world we live in with mental health.
Well, and we all only know our experience. And so
That's
I think
exactly it. I mean, look,
that's part of it.
as a social worker, you're trained to listen to experiences and trained with hopefully therapeutic reactions. Like to different situations that pose a challenge to somebody, and all of that. It's a thing that I don't think people come with naturally, and if they do, it's probably something they have to think about. So that's just a fact, and it is. All of this stuff is invisible.
Well, and it's also, I think that even when we do think about it, right? Like I've always had, well, I'm very sensitive to the world I'm in. I'm hypervigilant for reasons. I mean, I have empathetic responses, and yet my experiences absolutely encode my brain, right? And so there were certain things that it took me going through something to have a comprehension. Like somebody could say that they're having experience, and I could mentally conceptualize it. I couldn't necessarily actually get it because it wandered into the realm of that which is indisputable in my world structure, if you will. And so I had to go through something before I could actually really get and after I went through certain things, it was like, oh, these things that I thought I understood, but they were more of a concept. Now they're more of I get it. So that process also opened me up to understanding when it's a concept for me. When someone's explaining something and I can academically connect, and yet I recognize I have no context. So I'm not necessarily capable of doing anything but listening. And it's helpful, right? Because then I'm not going to jump in with, well, that's not happening, or you should just, right? You don't feel good, you should just I do this and I'm fine, whatever it is. And for example, something my first husband was I think pretty clinically depressed, and he was suicidal throughout his whole life. He passed away not from suicide a few years ago. And I was judgmental of it when we were together. We had children, and I was like, you don't get to be, I'm sad too. Like, I have a hard time. Like, you got to snap out of it. Like, I was not, and there was more to it, but I really wasn't able to comprehend that he had a pain I had never experienced. It was just not in my worldview at that time. And then over the years, as I grew and became more experienced, I recognized that I had no concept of his experience. That when he was telling me how he felt, how he saw the world, that it was nothing to do with anything I understood. And I apologized to him. I'm glad that I was able to have that conversation with him before he passed away, because I felt pretty awful that this person that he trusted couldn't give him support in that. It's like it's not capable of it. Even though I had like lots of care and awareness in a variety of areas, I was just blind there. And so that's something I try to remember, and having that experience is helpful, painful, but helpful in terms of other things, that when people tell me something and my first reaction is like, why is that? I'm like, wait a minute. I know what this why is that thing is. That's me conceptualizing it. That's me not having an experience that allows me to genuinely perceive that we're different. They're not a version of me. We are different. So at any rate, like, I think there's that too. Like, it doesn't matter how much you want to. If you don't have certain experiences, you may not know the experiences you don't have. and it's like requires something to get there. So, and I know
And
we
that's
should,
okay.
yeah. And we
It's
should
okay
probably have a final
to listen
thought.
to someone.
Yeah. It's okay to just listen. Exactly.
We're getting towards the end. Any final thoughts that you would like to share? And let me preface this by saying, I think I'd love to have you back on sooner than later, even just to talk about some of the progressive Christian stuff. That to me is a fascinating concept. And Roger definitely opened up my eyes that I had been stereotyping a lot of Christians just based on, again, like Issa said. So, you see these extremes and you hear about people holding, services during COVID because the blood of Christ will clean them of all disease. Like, cool story, and I have concerns, but I'm always interested to hear the different takes on it and some of the different interpretations. So with that in mind, any final thoughts on this topic?
Oh yeah, I would love to come back. I've enjoyed this immensely, and I've learned, and I hope you have too. And I think to kind of, and just to respond to Isla, and then just the last thing I had thought of was yeah, like I said, it's okay to not understand something and to just listen, but positive talk, like toxic positivity. I don't know if either of you have heard of that, but when we listen, we just quickly want to say like, well, it'll get better. I remember reading this grief article. This woman's husband had just died, and someone, to comfort her, in air quotes, went up to her and said, well, you're young, you'll marry again, at her husband's funeral.
Yeah.
Wow.
If that's not toxic positivity, like, I don't know what is. And it's like, with your situation, you were burnt out too, and it seems like with everything with the kids and everything going on. And that's where like the importance of self-care comes in. It's hard to to be there for somebody else when you're so burnt out. And with COVID, that happened to me. I remember when COVID was happening and I went through a breakup at the time, and it was just like, oh my gosh. And then like I had obviously like my parents were struggling financially, and like and I was working from home and I had to work fewer hours, and how can I help them? And there was so much, and I realized I cannot fall apart because I need to be there for my students. But that doesn't mean like I just grit my teeth and get back and that's it. It was like, as much as I didn't want to, I'm going to go back to therapy. And I went back, and because I was embarrassed, I was like, how can a social worker be in therapy? And my therapist reminded me, like, actually that's exactly what you should do. You're doing the very ethical thing, like by going to get therapy, make sure you're okay so that you can take care of your students. And I think that's just one of the very important things when there is someone in our lives who has such mental health concerns, the same as someone who has very physical health concerns. Self-care is so important. Like, self-care is the most selfless thing that you can do.
Yeah.
Like, people think it's selfish. And I think there's a very clear difference. Selfish would be like, if you are taking care of someone who's sick, like physically sick, and you have to help them take a shower, like let's say it's your significant other or whatever, or your parent or whatever. Selfish would be like if you're just being lazy and not doing anything, and they're like, hey, can you help me get up and go to the shower? And it's just like I don't feel like it. That's kind of selfish when you have the energy to, and you have the time, and it's your responsibility,
right?
And the capability, you just don't feel like it. self-care is very different. If you're coming home from work and you're exhausted and the person's asking you to do that and you're starving, to say, let me just have lunch. Sorry, I'm thinking dinner in this case. Let me just have a meal.
Yeah.
Then, drink something, just sit for a couple minutes, and then I can help you take a shower. Like, that is self-care. And if that person just goes in and it's like, okay, fine, let's get you in the shower. Like, just hurry up. Let's just why can't you take off your clothes? Like, no one wants to be in that situation. And I think with COVID, we have lost some, if not all, of our coping mechanisms at some point. The gyms were closing. You couldn't go out to hang out with your friends anymore. You couldn't, go on a date with your significant other, or all these things just suddenly disappeared. And what we've got to do is adapt, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe you can't do all that. Order food in and have a date night inside. Video chat with your friends, work out from home. It's just things that we have to keep in mind. And there's nothing wrong with self-care. It's very important. It's not selfish. And from there, everything else we've talked about stems from it.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think self-care is something most people don't think about it, but they have built-in coping mechanisms. I'm not like a big drinker or anything, but I didn't realize until COVID hit, and it's now been a year, how much going out every once in a while and just sitting in a bar, having a drink, watching a sport on TV, or just chilling out outside of the house was generally good for me. So, and on that note, thank you for being on. We'll definitely be in touch. We'll put some links in for some of the things you're doing. I'm going to go check them out myself. And we'd love to have you back. So.
Yeah, no, this is I really wish we could do a 3-hour show, but that's a bad idea.
Yeah. But we could do 3 hours. So
I love all the things
thanks
that
for having me.
Have brought to the table. It's been really interesting. So
this has definitely gone, more than what we originally thought. And thanks for having me. I'm definitely up for coming back.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you very much. And on that note,
thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media. We are BiCurean on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or give us a call at 303-578-9155 or email podcast@BiCurean.com.
And if you like what we're doing, please rate us on your listening platform of choice.
Thank you.